Hey, welcome back everyone to another epic Victoria 2 Dev Diary looking at. Okay, I have no idea where that came from. Anyway, yeah, I actually remember to record it the day after I recorded the previous Dev Diaries, so I'm more fresh. Wow! Incredible. Isn't it great to be a functioning human being? Anyway, we have number 11, which is employment and qualifications. We're coming up from the number 10, which is infrastructure, which was the last one that I recorded in the last video. So for today, we're going to look at 11 through 15. Now, this employment and qualification is kind of a companion to the POPs one, which they sort of nicely linked in here. I say linked to the POPs one because, of course, employments and qualifications basically mean, it's the quality of your POPs. And in Victoria 2, the way the system worked was that the POPs themselves were either of one type or another, while here POPs have a profession instead of being one POP type or another and then promoting or demoting from those. You have POP professions that can be, again, promoted or demoted independently of a couple of factors. Anyway, so this determines the social strata and influences of a number of things like wages, political strength, and interest group affiliation. Basically, buildings need POPs of specific professions to work in there in order to produce their intended effects on the economy and society. So, of course, government administration buildings will need bureaucrats. One type of industry will need laborers. Another type of industry, more advanced, will need laborers and also, for example, engineers and mechanists or whatever. Finally, in the production methods Dev Diary, we've learned that different production methods can indeed change the number of profession positions available in a building. So basically, Victoria 1 and Victoria 2 had POP types, while this game has POP professions. Basically, the main difference over here is the way in which POPs are promoted. In Victoria 2, POP promotion is very weird and esoteric, but basically, it is basically just dependent on the types of goods that are available and the POP wealth that is, and the POP wealth, the wealth and the education level of each single POP. So therefore, POPs that have more wealth and education will be able to promote to higher levels. Now, this is also a factor in the Victoria 3, of course, but you, of course, also have the building system to take into account, because in Victoria 2, for example, to get the bureaucrats, you pay administration costs, while in Victoria 3, to get the bureaucrats, you need the government buildings. So you don't need to set up the government administration sort of expenses slider. You need to build more bureaucracy buildings, which, yeah, it makes sense. These are the professions that you can see. Academics, so you've got your research. We'll probably need to build universities for those. Aristocrats, so you need to have arable land for those guys. Bureaucrats, you need to build production, administration buildings. Capitalists, they pop up the more industry you have. Clergymen, which I guess is going to be depending on churches, question mark. It's not academics, right? So I don't think it's educators in this case. Clerks, obviously. Once you start to upgrade your factories a little bit, you'll need clerks. And once you have more urban center buildings, which are basically the representation of artisans and clerks, like small shops. Engineers, so again, advanced factories. Farmers, build more industrial factories / have more whatever. Have more subsistence farming. Laborers, mines. Mechanists, certain types of factories. Officers, army. peasants, subsistence farmers, servicemen just recruit more troops. Shopkeepers have bigger towns, and slaves buy them from the slave market. I suppose, I don't know. I don't think there is a slave market in Victoria too, though it would be kind of funny because there is one in Solaris. Objectively, more advanced societies have more slavery, says Paradox. Anyway, basically, this is supposed to give the player more control over where job opportunities are created. So you're supposed to be able to kind of tell where you're going to be creating different types of more advanced professions. You're supposed to have a little bit more, I suppose, control over that. Although, I mean, in Victoria 2, you had the national focuses, which is, as far as I understand, have been removed from Victoria 3, so, or don't exist in Victoria 3. So, yeah. You gain some control, you lose some control. Of course, national focuses were kind of wonky and sometimes didn't work and you didn't know why. Anyway, so Victoria 3 higher paid pops don't by their very nature perform a more valuable societal function than lower paid jobs. Yeah, that's another thing. In Victoria 2, you have the different pop types that are basically directly related to income. Basically, an officer will always want to have more income than a soldier. Well, okay, in this case, it's going to be the same, obviously, in Victoria 3, but like a clerk is always going to be paid more than the craftsman. Now, in Victoria 3, that is going to depend on a different slider, that is the wealth, that is dependent on income, which, yes, of course, like a better profession is going to, on average, be paid more. And then that's going to convert into wealth, which is basically the standard of living of a pop. Well, wealth and standard of living are two different things, but like wealth is the money that goes into the standard of living. And so if there is more standard of living, then that pop is quote unquote wealthier. But the societal function it performs, the profession, is tied to it's basically the workplace having available jobs for that type of profession. So buildings won't increase wages due to labor competition. Oh no, okay, that's I need to go up a little bit more. Without enough laborers to shovel coal, the engines and machinists stay dormant. Yeah, I mean, that was kind of the same in Victoria 2, though, so I don't know why they're talking about that. So buildings adjust their wages over time in order to achieve full employment with minimal wage costs. As employment increases, so does the throughput, which is the degree by which the buildings consumes input goods and produces output goods. By the laws of supply and demand, this makes a building less profitable per capita the closer to full employment it gets, which is law of diminishing returns, basically. Or, you know, if you want to go a little bit more into the complex regions, it's the falling rate of profit. So at first blush, it might appear irrational for a building to pay more wages to reduce their margins, but since a building is not representing a single factory or enterprise, but rather a whole industrial sector across a large area, we assume that individual businesses in the sector compete with each other rather than engage in cartel behavior to extort consumers. I mean, bold assumption of you. The adjustment of wages to maximize employment makes sense. I mean, it also makes sense because if buildings are hiring to fulfill their employment, you probably are assuming that the hiring costs less than whatever, shoots himself in the head. However, buildings won't increase wages due to labor competition if this would cause them to go into deficit. Yeah, exactly. So they're also paying the premium for the workers because it's still profitable. Like that's, you know, how capitalism works. Cost benefit analysis. So there's little point to expanding industries beyond the point where they're profitable, unless you're doing a Keynesianism. Employees are hired into the available jobs from the pool of. Also, if you're like playing a very like hands-on economic game, there could be point to expanding industries beyond the point where they're profitable, because you might want to be expanding a certain industry to drive down the price of those goods in your home market. So, paradox, play your own game. Employees are hired into available jobs from the pool of pops that already exist in the state, but unless they're unemployed, these pops will always have a job somewhere else doing something else. So pops can be hired under two conditions. First, they must be offered a measurably higher wage than the wage they're currently getting from their current employment. Second, unless they're already working in the required profession in another building, they must also meet the qualifications of that profession to change into it. So basically what this means is pops will always seek to maximize their own salary, which is not exactly how people work, but in terms of like the depth of simulation of Victoria Free, it is how people would work, so this makes sense. Because you can't really take into account quality of life, I suppose. And so, if you have an engineer that is being paid less than he would be paid to be a laborer somewhere else, that guy's going to try to become a laborer somewhere else, even though it's a lower quote unquote qualification profession, right? But of course, most of the time, you're going to try to upgrade the professions, right? Or at least the pops are going to try to upgrade because the wages are going to be higher. So that means that most of the times for pop promotion or profession promotions to happen, these pops will need to have some requirements met, which is basically the same as Victoria too. Like they're going to need to be somewhat educated. They're going to need to have access to better goods. They're going to need to have enough wealth to do so. Yeah, basically there's a bit of a graphic that you can see here. If you look at your building, you're going to see how many people are employed versus the total employment possible, so the employment level. And you can see the latest employment changes and who is becoming who, which is a welcome thing that you have that in the buildings, because having to look at pop promotion from the pop screen was a nightmare in Victoria 2. So I actually really enjoy this change. I do prefer it over what it was before. And it's also going to be somewhat explicative of the mechanics of your economy, of what's going on in your current economy, compared to, again, what you had before, which is kind of ooga booga magic. People are changing because the wizard is turning them into another different, I don't know. Wages are set by individual buildings in response to market conditions. Oh no, Austrian economics. A building that is losing money will decrease wages until it's back in the black. A building that has open jobs it can't seem to fill will raise wages until it either fills the necessary positions or runs out of excess profits. Yeah, you are assuming that capitalists are extremely rational there, Paradox. Current look at the labor market, especially in some countries, does not suggest that this is the case, but whatever. As a result, different buildings in the same state will compete for the available workforce. What this means in practice is that a large population with the necessary qualification to perform all the jobs being created in the state will keep wages depressed and profits high. So basically, high supply of labor equals profits are high, which, yeah, of course, duh. Only when industries are large or advanced enough that they need to compete with each other for a limited pool of qualified workers, wages are forced to rise, or unless, or if the population somehow declines, I suppose. This rise in wages will also come with, or a substantial increase in demands for a certain type of employment. This rise in wages will also come with increased consumption, which increases demands for goods and services that come out of the same buildings. That some of the same buildings may profit from in the end. So basically, the little like virtuous circle of like economic development or whatever. Increased wages lead to better, sort of higher levels of consumption, which lead to higher profits. And yeah, I mean, there's probably not going to be enough like oomph to the economic simulation to also simulate that. Another type of thing is that higher wages generally mean that to increase the profit margin, the enterprise will need to invest more into the enterprise, generally into what the game would call production methods, therefore means of production, therefore machines or whatever, technology, research and development, that kind of stuff. So generally higher wage economies also mean higher rates of investment, even though the investment returns are lower, probably way beyond the scope of what Victoria or probably any game can actually accomplish in terms of economic simulation. But sort of not placebo, sort of, I don't know, replacement mechanic is around. So a pop's qualifications, basically higher wage is good. A pop's qualification measure how many of its workforce qualify for certain professions and updates monthly. Yes, of course. For example, at least a basic education level is required to become a machinist, while a much higher one is required to become an engineer. Conversely, the ability to become an aristocrat is less about education and more about the social class and wealth, of course. And then it tells you basically the qualifications required for the workforce to turn into engineers. It tells you the influence that literacy and wealth are having on that pop being able to become an engineer. I'm not sure exactly how good the actual UI is going to be, but I like that a lot of this information is actually available. Perhaps too much information is available because, yeah, I don't know. If some paper mills require more engineers and this pop was being considered, only the amount of qualified engineers so far can be hired. Obviously. Right, so this is aristocrats. Looks like officers are better able to become aristocrats. Cultural discrimination? I've said this once before, but countries don't culturally discriminate in the aristocracy. They culturally discriminate, for example, in academia or whatever, right? Like, no feudal country is going to be like, oh no, you can't become an aristocrat because you're another culture, because the class bond is more important than the fucking kills himself. I don't know, this whole like fucking this whole fucking cultural discrimination thing makes sense when it comes to like government employment, right? Maybe soldiers, even all the way down to soldiers, and all the way up to officers and bureaucrats. It does not make sense in the wider whatever. I don't know. Like all pop attributes, qualification follow the pops as they split, merge, move between buildings, migrate, and die. Incredible. If you had previously developed a potential bureaucrat in your country, but ran into budgetary problems and had to shut down your government buildings, over time, those pops who have already developed the qualification to become bureaucrats will die off and not be replaced by newly educated ones. Okay. All right. Interesting. So basically, qualifications are going to be very, very sort of elastic in this way. And then you get a breakdown of all pops that can become engineers in Lower Egypt. Okay, so this is supposed to tell you, okay, if you were to build a certain type of structure, potentially how much, okay. again, I like the information, but I'm not sure if you should like know this, right? Like, does a government in the 19th century really have the tool? Governments today have will have a hard time calculating something like this. Like, okay, well, we have like standardized education systems now, so you can calculate a potential workforce for a single type of job, but I don't know. In fact, schools and actually no, it's like chambers of commerce here in it. Well, it's employers associations here in Italy. They do that quite frequently, but again, it's like very very vague, very very vague calculation. Anyway, intent of qualification is a single signal to a player what capacity for employment they have among any subset of their population. They cannot, for example, conquer a state filled with undereducated people they also legally discriminate against and expect to immediately build up manufacturing and trading centers there. Okay, obviously. By building out their education system, paying bureaucracy to extend their administrative reach to the new state for incorporation, and changing their laws to extend citizenship to new residents, they can start to build this capacity also in the locals. In other words, be America. And don't be Russia. Okay. So, number 12, Treasury. This is going to be interesting. I looked at it before. They did something weird with money. They made it like an EU free, or like also like in Darkest Hour. Like they made it like the old sliders mechanic, except you'll see. Except like basically without well no, yeah, it's basically like that. So basically you don't accumulate money and then spend it on shit. Generally, you can accumulate money, but what you do is you spend the money and you earn the money simultaneously. So basically what you have over there is the balance of payments. That's what is important. So the balance of payments is basically your weekly sort of budget surplus or deficit, right? And if you have a surplus, the money is going to go into your gold reserves, which is not supposed to be as important as your currency reserves in Victoria 2 or in many other games. Also because if your gold reserves are going up too high, then somehow the money is going to be wasted. I don't exactly understand it. Well, let's check it out. So basically, you might want to build a building that costs 100 money and your monthly income is 10 money. That means that in order to build said building, you will have to wait 10 months to accumulate the 100 money needed for the lump sum to cover the cost of said building. That's not how it works in Victoria Free. In Victoria Free, that money goes immediately into the deficit and goes immediately, if you don't have any reserves, into debt. So yeah, that's basically how it works. So basically, the income and expenses are tallied up, and the result is then applied to either your gold reserve or national debt. And you do not need any cash on hand, quote unquote, to start your construction of a bunch of buildings at once. But if you don't have the revenue to support it, you will find yourself quickly going into debt, which is a more realistic appreciation of how a government's finances generally work. Because governments have almost unlimited credit, question mark, sort of, because governments have national banks, they can print money, they have the ability to release bonds, because hey, governments are generally pretty trustworthy investments. They'll generally pay you back, otherwise they'd collapse. So yeah, they basically have unlimited money, and that's like Draghi, tecnicamente non possiamo finire I soldi. Oh. Let me see. Yeah, there we go. That's basic. This is basically what's going on over here. This is Italian. It says, "Can the European Central Bank ever run out of money?" And Mario Draghi, the current Prime Minister of Italy and former governor of the European Central Bank, asks, "Well, technically, no, we cannot run out of money." he just said it. Technically, we cannot run out of money. So yeah, technically, you cannot run out of money, but you can go bankrupt, and we'll see how the mechanics work out there. The gold reserve is the national stockpile of cash. Now, it's interesting that they're calling it the gold reserve because, like, countries have currency reserves as well. In the modern day, mostly foreign reserves or wealth funds, sovereign funds, which are not exactly a treasury in the old style, but basically they serve the same function, except they're supposed to be kind of reinvesting the money in one way or another, and they're supposed to be like sort of independently governed and not accessible at the whims of the government. But like gold reserves are a very like, yeah, they're a very like 18th 19th century type of deal because of the gold standard, but like not everyone at this time was using the gold standard. I would have called it the reserve anyway. I would have just called it the reserve. Why do you have to call it the gold reserve? It just makes the game less accurate. Like, not all the countries in the world have a gold reserve at this point. China, for example, as far as I'm aware, did not have gold reserve. It was backing its currency with silver. I don't know, whatever. Anyway, conversely, if your expenses exceed your income, then money is taken out of gold reserve to balance the books. So that can be used to pay for shit that you don't currently have the money for, of course, because it's gold, it's a reserve. It isn't necessarily the best idea to continue run a large budget surplus. Each country has a gold reserve limit, which is a soft cap over which each surplus pound has diminishing returns on the gold reserve, which is what I don't really understand. Like, okay, like I understand the idea of it because countries don't really stockpile money over a certain amount. Sort of? Question mark. Did countries in the 19th? You wouldn't need to have like a political economy 19th century expert guy to explain this to me because I'm not like knowledgeable enough to know whether or not it was the case. Certainly countries today don't because interest rates are low, so you always just borrow money. You never have like on hand reserves unless we're talking about foreign currency reserves, which are a very specific type of reserve, or gold, which is an even more specific type of reserve that not like countries don't really have like billions like or trillions in gold or whatever. They're a small portion of the GDP all the time. Anyway, if you have an enormous stockpile of gold, a surplus of 10k pounds will only increase your stockpile by as little as 2k pounds, meaning that you're basically wasting the rest of your money. So, okay. I suppose this is because you're buying the gold, so if you have more gold, the gold price goes up. I guess it's kind of a like gold inflation. I don't know. Whatever. So the Spanish are trolling, and in this image, the Spanish are trolling, and they have too much gold. Spanish problems. So what if you're running a deficit and your gold reserve has all been tapped? Well, this is when debt comes into play. Beyond that point, each pound spent in excess of your income will automatically result in taking on debt. Well, this may sound like something you need to avoid at all costs. This isn't necessarily true. While you do have to pay interest on your loans, interest rates in Victoria Free are relatively low, and so as long as you avoid hitting your debt ceiling, growing your economy for deficit spending can actually be a very valid strategy, which is something that I appreciate a lot, because in Victoria too, it was very esoteric. Like, the bankruptcy limit thing was very esoteric. You never had an idea how much debt you could actually take on before you went bankrupt. So, in general, you just try to avoid taking debt at all. Plus, in general, interest rates were kind of weird. So, you never really knew whether or not it was okay to take debt. You just generally tended to avoid it. But in real life, this was the period in time in which, yeah, you started to have very widespread banking systems and credit institutions that were developing rapidly. So the amount of available credit was increasing rapidly for a lot of nation states, basically, because they were having their own national banks, they were having their own private banks being sort of growing, and so they were able to increasingly take on debt to finance their existence, while previously, basically all the way up to the late 16th 17th century, banks were very, very small, question mark, sort of, except for Italian banks and the Renaissance or whatever. And interest rates were higher, partially because of systemic reasons, and partially because, again, there was less credit supply. So, yeah, they could afford to charge more interest. Now the interest rates are going down, and they basically went down, and they're still very, very low today because more credit and more stable borrowers, basically. Anyway, so basically, the increase in revenues from investing the money that you're taking on in terms of debt into your economy will later exceed the interest payments. So the idea is, if the return on investment is higher than the interest rates on your loans, then it makes sense to borrow and spend, because then the line will go up before the other line goes up. And that's why all governments today have ridiculously high levels of debt, because they can kind of afford to pay the interest because the growth rate is higher than the interest rate. Except, yeah, sovereign debts sometimes are a problem. Because, again, there's a debt ceiling, which in real life, again, is kind of a very ephemeral thing. But in Victoria 2, you have a set debt ceiling, and if you go higher than that, you go bankrupt, which means that you cannot pay basically anything until you're able to basically reborrow the money to pay the previous blah blah blah, and reset your economy, which has immensely negative industry consequences on your domestic industry. So the main forms of income expenditures for the state is, of course, you have your taxes, your income taxes, your poll taxes. You have your minting, which is great. It's basically printing money, although it's called minting because it was still like metal money. I just smashed my table because, I don't know, for some reason that. Okay. You have your minting, which, I don't know, can you like increase or decrease your levels of it? I don't know, whatever. Then you have your poll taxes, your land taxes. Ooh, Georgism moment. Oh my god, sexy Georgism, land value tax. Consumption taxes, which is VAT or VAT. Tax that is levied on purchases. What everybody the tax everyone loves, but no government seems to be able to make do without. Dividend taxes, which is basically capital gains. And then you have tariffs. Now, Paradox doesn't seem to understand how tariffs work, because they say tariffs are something we will have to plan to have in the game as a way of profit from goods being exported from your market. That's not what tariffs are, Paradox. Please spell check or like edit the. Do you need an editor? Do you need an editor? I don't know. What I like in the taxes and in the expenses is the fact that you don't just have like a slider, right? Now I like sliders, but oh, well, this is also like a slider, but you have levels, right? So what this allows Paradox to do is it allows for you to be punished in terms of basically pop militancy or pop happiness, rewarded in terms of pop happiness from increasing or decreasing taxes or salaries. So basically, what you had in Victoria 2 was if the taxes are high, people are going to slowly but surely get angry. If you then lower the taxes, they're going to slowly but surely get less angry. While here, I'm sure you're going to be slowly but surely getting more angry if the taxes are higher or whatever, and if the salaries are low or whatever. But if you suddenly hike the taxes, people are going to be super angry at the moment, which is, yeah, really, really, really good. Anyway, next Dev Diary that we have is the standard of living, which is rather simple. It's basically life needs and luxury needs or whatever. Except it's on a scale between 1 and 99. So you have levels 1 to 4, which are labeled starving, 5 to 9, struggling, and so on and so forth. And so on and so on. I am a Slavoj Žižek. And then you get to 60 plus, which is opulent. So you have all that scale left for extremely opulent motherfuckers. Now, standard of living affects two major aspects of the game, which is the birth and the death rate and the pop loyalty, of course, because more standard of living equals less people wanting to revolt. Now, the birth and death rate is super interesting because they're trying to simulate demographic transition, which is that phenomenon where basically the higher the average development and income levels, and the higher, for example, the technological levels in a society, the less people will be born, but also the less people will be dying. So birth rates and death rates are going to be lowering. Now, what you have is that for a while, the death rates are basically plummeting much faster than the birth rates are going down. So, like, for example, you're going from like an average of 8 to 10 children per woman, so per family, to like maybe 4. But all those 4 children, maybe 3 if you're unlucky, are going to survive. And also people are going to be living not to 40, but to 60, right? Maybe 70. So this means that you have a population boom, right? If you look at, for example, let's take a look at the population of Great Britain throughout the ages or whatever. I would love for there to be a little bit of a longer time scale, please. Okay, I found a better scale. So you can see basically what's going on, right? 1800 rolls around. You have the sort of first demographic transition coming into play, and what you have is actually is it recording? Yes, it is. What you have is that death rates go down severely, and the population kind of explodes, right? Now, what you would have in a second phase is that the birth rates fall faster than the death rates, which would slow it down, as you can see. But of course, that's not at all within the time frame of Victoria 3, so that's fine. And of course, you also have certain laws that are going to affect the birth rates and death rates, such as, again, having women in the workplace and stuff like that, which obviously is going to decrease the birth rate, but it's going to increase the workforce ratio. Otherwise, how many of your pops are actually working or not? Now, of course, if you have a standard of living decline, then the pop loyalty is going to be affected. If you have a standard of living increase, then the pop loyalty is going to be affected in the opposite direction, which is pretty good. Now, pop wealth forms the foundation for its standard of living. What does this mean? Basically, if your pops are able to buy the goods, then their standard of living is going to increase. So the pop wealth is, of course, the sort of prerequisite to standard of living. Pops can also gain more intangible boosts or penalties to their standard of living from any number of sources, so I'm guessing various shit that can happen. Yeah, they accumulate wealth with wages. Of course, as wealth changes, the consumption also changes, which affects the prices of goods in the market, which might in turn affect their wages, dividends, etc. Blah, blah, blah. You see the little calculations. You can actually go in and look at the net income. You can go in and look at the pop needs and how much wealth is required to actually fulfill them, which is pretty good. And as you can see, for example, for a low wealth pop, it's only going to have basically the simple consumption patterns. And of course, you can see it. You can see every single need. For example, in here we have the heating expenses for 235,000 Tamil peasants in Ceylon. You can see them broken down by resource expenditure and what is needed to actually buy up that need, which is pretty good. Lots of nice info, more info. Yeah, lower wealth has fewer needs. Then introducing new goods into your market will help you diversify your economy and alleviate the demand on crucial industrial goods. So that's basically reducing overall stress on the consumption and increasing overall standards of living. Is there anything else particularly interesting? Oh, of course, as you unlock new stuff, it's going to have new goods are going to fulfill different needs. So, of course, this is going to scale throughout the game. In addition to these factors, cultures can develop obsessions for certain goods, which is quite interesting. Some even have taboos they must abide by. So this is basically like Muslim people don't drink alcohol or whatever, right? Which is pretty good. I like the idea of that being a thing. Give you a little tiny bit of customization to cultures. And I love how a country can also encourage or discourage the consumption of certain goods using authority. So you can do a bit of a deep state mind op to convince people to buy a certain type of good instead of another one, which is going to make them have an obsession for it or whatever. Yeah, let's close out by considering the difference between this and the consumption model for previous games. In Victoria 2, pops have different life, everyday, and luxury needs based on their type, what we call professions in Victoria 3, both types of goods and quantities. Pops in Victoria 2 will always strive to get promoted into types which require more advanced, luxurious goods in larger quantities, but will fail to do so if they cannot afford it. Since certain advanced types of pops in Victoria 2 perform the duties objectively better than their less advanced counterparts, it becomes important to retain access to advanced goods in order to ensure that your workforce is internationally competitive. Well, I mean, of course, this is different because of the profession system in Victoria 3, and the profession system is kind of decoupled from standard of living, as far as I understand. So you can have a not particularly wealthy engineer because maybe they're not able to access all the goods. And so, or not a not particularly high standard of living engineer because they're not able to access all the goods. So, but he still can become an engineer. Whereas in Victoria 2, you would need to have the access to those goods. Otherwise, the guy's going to get demoted back into being like a laborer or whatever. So, yeah, looks like basically the focus when it comes to upgrading your pops is going to be on the education side of things in Vicky Free. And pops will not always strive to ascend to a higher social strata, nor will an aristocrat always have a higher income or goods consumption needs compared to a clerk. Okay. All this is driven by macro forces. A qualifying clerk would gladly become an aristocrat if only available land. If that comes with a higher income, then remaining a clerk. Okay, that's pretty much understandable. If you build a colonial plantation economy, your aristocrats might remain as dominant by the endgame as they were at the start. Okay. I mean, of course, this kind of would be the case in Victoria too as well, but whatever. Let's not get too deep into that kind of stuff. These possibilities for diverse pop distribution also result in different political tendencies in your population, which lead to demand for different kinds of laws. So it's going to perhaps be more likely that at the end you have a very sort of unliberal country, depending on the choices that you've made when actually building the economy, which is, yeah, that makes sense. I like it. Anyway, next Dev Diary. What we have now is the political movements, number 14. Now, the political movement is very much the same as the movements in Victoria 2. You basically have a movement to either enact a certain reform, to restore and basically go back a reform or a law, and a movement to preserve, which is the sort of newer type. You didn't have like conservative movements or conservative rebels in Victoria 2. You only had either reactionaries or quote unquote progressives or whatever. But other than that, it's very, very much the same, except I don't know exactly how rebellion works. I know that down the line they explain that basically civil wars are going to happen if a certain movement is going to get too radical. But I do not know if you just have like small rebellions or if it's only civil war, which I'm not the biggest fan of. I mean, I would have liked there to be a relatively dynamic rebel system like in Victoria 2, except perhaps slightly more focused on like having bigger rebellions, like just having like random 3,000 Jacobins or whatever every once in a while is kind of dumb. Like they should probably make it so when rebellions come, they're big. But I like the rebellion system because it's like, yeah, sometimes you have smaller rebellions and sometimes you have a gigantic rebellion that's basically a civil war. But I also do like that they have like civil wars, which are going to just like split that country in half and maybe release a tag that's going to fight with you. That would be pretty good. Anyway, you have basically that a political movement has an amount of support in the country that is determined by two factors. One, how many pops are supporting it, so straight up numbers, and two, what interest groups are supporting them. And of course, interest groups derive their power not just from numbers of support, but also from, the standard of living and the wealth of their members. So what you can have is that you can have a reactionary movement that, for example, only has the support of a small amount of pops, but also a large amount of interest groups or very powerful interest groups that can maybe counterbalance or overmatch a progressive, quote unquote, movement that is supported by more people. So yeah, that's that support mechanic really quite interesting how they've integrated both the interest groups and the pops. In Victoria 2, you only had the pops supporting movements. So yeah, integrating the interest groups is a good thing, just nice little quality of life upgrade. But other than that, I really don't have any other. Any other thoughts on these Victoria free movements. They're pretty much just the same thing as they were in Victoria 2. I like it. People, if a movement does not get what it wants, will become more and more radical, and if there's a lot of people and the support is strong and it's not being enacted, then it's going to get very radical very quickly, and that's going to create a lot of radicals, which is going to create the civil war or whatever. So that's nice. And then you can go to Dev Diary number 15, which is Slavere. Am I still recording? Yes, good. Now, Slavere, sorry for the racist southern accent right there. They spend 4 chapters, I guess, apologizing for having slavery. It's kind of weird. Like I really don't see why they have to justify putting slavery in a game about the 19th century with 4 paragraphs, but whatever. Um, like it's important that it's in there. It's a pretty important part of this history. You know what I mean? Anyway, slaves are technically a pop profession, of course, in WikiFree. Now, of course, it's not a, it's not the same profession as all the other professions, right? Because you cannot like choose to not be a slave, and they don't get wages. So basically, their mechanics are very unique. Just like in real, when you realize you like said something insane because paradox games. Slaves also just aren't just able to be stop being slaves, and basically their standard of living needs to be controlled not by their pop wealth, therefore, because they don't have wages, they don't have wealth, but it's controlled by the workplaces, basically. The buildings that employ slaves also do so in a way that differs from the way they employ other professions. The gist of how that works is that in a state that has slaves, certain buildings, for example plantations, that employ laborers or peasants, can fill each available position for those professions with either a laborer or a slave. And of course, they're going to prefer using slaves. So, yeah. Now, the benefits of slavery, of course, is for the aristocrats that operate the plantations because they don't pay wages. They instead buy goods, and those goods get passed down to the pops. So, based on factors such as laws, profitability, and a bunch of stuff, purchases the necessary goods for that target standard of living, which might be like, you know, here we have struggling 5, but it might be higher. The target standard of living may not always be at the level of outright starvation, but is never going to be anything but a very basic existence. Now, this is pretty interesting because if you look at like a lot of the apology of slavery, especially in the South, in the American South, in the mid 1800s, what you have is that you had a lot of arguments that actually slaves were quote unquote better treated than northern factory workers, and according to like some indicators, for example, meat consumption per capita, they were right, which is that's a big ol' wallop of weird right there. Yeah, like it's more of a, I guess it's more of a whoopsie for northern capitalism, I guess, than a win for southern slavery. Yeah. Anyway, so this little sentence right here is is never going to be anything but a very basic existence. I mean, the cost to purchase said goods is simply added to as a building expense and is virtually always going to be cheaper than employing paid labor. Again, a lot of the arguments before the mid 1800s, actually in the early stages of the 19th century, while the American South was going through a phase where abolitionism was actually getting slightly more popular, and then it was crushed because of the political competition with the North. What you had is that you had some arguments that like basically it would be cheaper to just pay people than maintain slaves. In part because there was this ideology of like paternalistic Christian white man's burden type of bullshit where the slave owner was, at least in theory, supposed to be providing for the slave. Of course, this is completely theory and almost never happened, but there were a lot of people that said, hey, economically, it would be better to not have slavery because labor is cheaper if you don't have slavery, in part because, again, the slave trade had been banned, and therefore the price of slaves was really, really high. If I recall correctly, just like random numbers off the top of my head, numbers that I've heard recently, a slave could cost like $1,000 while a worker could be paid like $8 a month to do the same job. So you can do the math right there, right? $8 a month times 12, 80 plus 16, 96, circa $100 a month, or a year. The slave costs 10 years of wages. Like, holy shit. Yeah, like, slaves are, and then you're also, like, of course, paying for food or whatever. Yeah, like, don't ask me. You definitely need to like ask a slavery expert about these kinds of things. But yeah, slavery is a complex issue, and I really don't want to be oversimplifying it. And I also kind of understand that like Paradox needs to oversimplify it because it's a game, so you need to kind of gamify it. But yeah, the slavery is complex. Anyway, slaves also do not pay taxes in any form, so if the government wants to convert those profits into revenue, they have to do so through the various forms of wealth-based taxes. They're always going to be deeply unpopular with the powerful elite. So in other words, slavery, good for the aristocrats, bad for the whole country, because you're not taxing slaves, and the profits are going to a tiny clique of aristocrats, who are not going to be particularly willing to share the wealth. You know what I mean? So Huey Long is going to need to come in there and like beat them with a stick or whatever. Anyway, yeah, slaves work more per pop, like more slaves within a pop work than normal laborers, so you have a smaller dependency ratio. And of course, slaves can only be put to work in very sort of agrarian and agrarian-y sectors, so you're not going to have like an industry with slaves, right? You're not Aberspeer, you cannot do that. That's verboten. Obviously, it wouldn't make any sense. It doesn't work. Case in point, go look at what happened with the Nazi slave labor industry. It was not a good idea. Anyway, you can also have, of course, resistance to slavery. Slaves are not going to be content with their lot in life and will attempt to resist by whatever means are available to them. Mechanically, this translates into a steady stream of radicalized slaves and the threat of turmoil and slave uprisings. This threat to a slave society can usually be averted with sufficiently repressive measures, but fear and violence is not a good foundation for a completely stable country. Oh, really? Who would have guessed? And also another like malice to having slavery in terms of just a purely strategy sort of game perspective is that you're going to get abolitionist movements, and of course that's creating opposition in the non-slave population. So that's going to create sort of two blocks of potential opposition. That is the slaves themselves and the abolitionists that are going to get sort of stronger as the game goes on, of course. And also certain other countries might just like randomly troll you into not being a slave state because maybe they don't want to get the slavery things. You know what I mean? Maybe they don't like your slavery. Anyway, there's 4 slavery laws. You have the slavery abolished, you have the debt slavery, you have the slave trade, and you have the legacy slavery. Now, slavery abolished, pretty much self-explanatory. Debt slavery, this basically means that when pops are growing too poor, they're going to sell themselves into slavery, which is basically what was happening in the Roman Empire. It's what was happening in a lot of societies. Even without it being formally slavery, for example, in China, there's kind of a debate as to whether or not like what China had is more akin to slavery or serfdom. In terms of like forced labor, the Chinese always had like forced labor from outside peoples, but in terms of like Chinese people, it's kind of debatable whether or not they ever really had slavery. And it was more of a serfdom corvée type of deal, but people could get into debt and basically become bond servants of a patron, essentially. And yeah, this is as I say, common in a lot of societies throughout the history or whatever. Now, the slave trade is just that straight up like okay level European chattel slavery, colonial chattel slavery. Um, yeah, practiced in places such as Brazil and Cuba and San Domingue, future like past Haiti, um, and you know, a bunch of Caribbean islands, southern United States for a long time. Basically, the children of slaves are born as slaves, and new slaves can also be imported from abroad. And we'll not go over exactly how slave import works today. I'm not sure. That's going to be quite an interesting little mechanic, I'm certain. But the gist of it is that slaves can be imported from decentralized countries that practice slavery if the importer has established interest in the region, more an interest at a later point. Ah, okay, that's quite interesting. I made a pun. Kill me, please, kill me. Anyway, legacy slavery is basically the U.S. After independence, they eventually abolished the slave trade, and they had the whole certain states abolishing slavery, certain states did not abolish slavery. So, since this model where basically slavery was overall legal, but you could not import slaves, although they did it, there was a contraband in slaves. In fact, even the government in a lot of southern states was in on it. What they would do is that they would have like basically fake. They would kind of like just have kind of like imagine if like the police were confiscating drugs on the Mexican border or whatever and then reselling them. Uh, they probably do that. I'm not sure. Do they do that? Any American listeners and viewers, please tell me if they do that. They probably do. Basically, what they would have is that they would have like their customs police or whatever confiscate slaves, right? Slave ships that were contrabanding slaves illegally from like Cuba or whatever, right? And then what they would do is that they would auction off the slaves because oftentimes, of course, this was in the southern states, so slavery was legal. So like it was the act of bringing the slaves over to the US was illegal. So the state would confiscate the slaves, but the slaves being slaves was not illegal. So that was property. So they auctioned it off as any other like contraband that was seized. So basically, the state could make a profit off of that, and a lot of the times there was kind of a deal between the racketeer, kind of this racketeer state, and the smugglers. So yeah, well, amazing. Anyway, technically it's illegal to import them, but anyone who is born a slave is also a slave. Unlike in debt slavery, where people who are born slaves are born free. And since this basically only existed in the United States, they fought also to insert in the free states and slave states mechanic, of course. Now, in real life, this was more just because of the federal slash confederal, because like before the Civil War, the U.S. was still kind of like a union of states more than a bunch of states that really are under a union. Like it was not really a like nation state. While afterwards, it's kind of just a big old nation state with a bit of a quirky like political setup that's slightly more federal than usual. But yeah, basically the sort of federal slash a little bit of confederacy was still in it from the basically federalist debates, combined with their particular type of slavery. That's what spawned the whole free states and slave states stuff. No other like country had this kind of separation in their mainland. Like a lot of European colonies or a lot of European countries had slavery outlawed in their home country. A lot of times this was because like you're not supposed to enslave other Christians or whatever. But slavery was allowed in the colonies. So this was, of course, basically France before the Revolution, Spain, etc., etc. And I believe also Portugal like abolished slavery pretty late, which also sort of rubbed off on Brazil. Brazil abolished slavery pretty late. But basically, what you had is that the dividing factor was metropole colony and not really like internal divisions within the country. It was more like there's this part of the country that's kind of weird and it's far away, and slavery is allowed there. There's even like a case of I believe a Caribbean slave or someone that was like enslaved in the Caribbean, maybe who was African, in a British colony, managing to escape over to Britain, and in Britain he was freed because he had gotten to Britain, and therefore if he's in Britain then he's free because there's no slavery in Britain, therefore he can't be made a slave again, which is like fucking mind-boggling like legal hilarity from a bygone age. Like it's kind of hilarious how this is kind of oddly like more progressive than the law would be today, but whatever. I don't know. Like if slavery still existed today, I don't think that would be possible. It's kind of the weird quirkiness of colonialism. Anyway, that's that for slavery, and that's that also for this video. So I definitely hope that you've enjoyed. Next up, we're going to be waiting for a few more Dev Diaries to come around. Right now, the number 16 states has been released a few days ago as I'm recording this. There's China! Oh no, China! I love China. Racism. Bit of a market town moment. Okay, yeah, that's about it. So I want to thank you for watching. Hope you've enjoyed, and I'll see you soon.